A reading rainbow. A reading rainbow.
If you were going to create some type of holy trinity of modern science fiction, it would probably be made of Gene Roddenberry, George Lucas, their flaws considered, and finally, Douglas Adams. The former head writer of Doctor Who made a name for himself independent of that production in the late 70s with what has now become one of sci-fi's most memorable works, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which started as a radio drama in 1978 before Adams eventually compiled the first episode stories into a full book that was first published a year later. The series would eventually become its own franchise that would last 5 books, 6 if you include the one penned by A.O. and Kofer after Adams' death, while the radio series continued on in multiple incarnations through 2018. And of course there was the 2005 theatrical movie that, let's just say, some people had issues with. But in between all of those was a TV miniseries that premiered on BBC Two in 1981 and was loosely based off of both the radio show and the first 2 books, since those were the only ones published at the time. Now, I want to make it clear that any and all comparisons I will be making here are to the books and not the radio drama, even though the latter actually came first, simply because I haven't followed the radio play. From what I've heard, some things I liked about the books were taken into greater detail in the radio version, so I probably should check it out one day. But for now, let's look at the original television adaptation of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We open with a countdown on how many hours are left before the Earth is destroyed. Am I sure I didn't mistakenly log on to a QAnon subreddit? Now, this series is only 6 episodes long, and for what it's worth, I may just skim over the first 4 episodes, because to be honest, I don't have a ton to say about them. And that's because they do follow Adams' original story pretty well. They even include the dialogue from the chapters that merely existed to provide biting commentary on the state of people and the Earth and around the universe, as provided by this narrator voiced by Peter Jones.
More controversial than Ulan Kalufid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyway?
A lot of times, adding narrators can be a major pain for the audience, but it works here because it's not just telling instead of showing in regards to the actual plot. It's providing supplemental info that is helpful in describing the social commentary that Douglas Adams was meaning to convey.
Accurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in 2 important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and secondly, it has the words "Don't Panic" inscribed in large, friendly letters on the cover.
Anyway, the story itself. It of course centers around Arthur Dent, a hard-luck individual whose house is about to be demolished for a new bypass, which the city pretty much made it impossible for him to prevent through ridiculous bureaucracy. Only for them to be one-upped in this department by an alien race called the Vogons, who are slated to demolish the entire Earth to make way for a hyperspace bypass. And George Lucas didn't try to sue the BBC over that one? Arthur is saved by his friend Ford Prefect, bumming them a ride onto the Vogon ship, because it turns out he's an alien who's been on Earth during research for the aforementioned Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. They are eventually taken prisoner by the Vogons, subjected to horrible Vogon poetry, and then thrown out into the vacuum of space to die. only to be saved when they are intercepted by the Heart of Gold spaceship that was stolen by a two-headed alien called Zaphod Beeblebrox and his human assistant Trillian, who Zaphod cock-blocked from Arthur some years ago while visiting on Earth and convinced her to fly away with. What is it with British sci-fi shows and their obsession with hot women running off with aliens? And this is the first major gripe I have to have with the show. What the frickin' frack did they do to Trillian? It's really bad when the American-made movie actually did a better job casting this role than the British production. Trillian was described in the books as not only being fairly intelligent, but also darkish with long waves of black hair, making me think of someone who looked like Princess Jasmine. Now, true, Zooey Deschanel didn't perfectly fit that look either, but it was still closer than Sandra Dickinson here, looking and playing her like a bubble-headed bleach blonde from a Don Henley song.
I'm not getting you down at all, am I?
No, Marvin, that's just fine, really.
I wouldn't like to think I was getting you down.
No, don't you worry about that. You just act as comes naturally and everything will be fine.
And for the record, Dickinson was one of 2 actors that were not carried over from the radio drama. Anyway, they make it to the planet Magrathea, where another alien named Slartibartfast reveals to Arthur that the Earth was in fact a giant computer commissioned by a couple of mice to find out what the ultimate question is to life, the universe, and everything, since those wanting to know it had already figured out that the answer is 42. They end up being pursued by the mice who want Arthur's brain in hopes he now has what they're looking for, as well as intergalactic cops out to get Zaphod before an exploding computer takes them all to...
Good evening, madam. Gentlemen, do you have a reservation?
And here's where we get to the real problems of this version. As I said, the TV series adapts the first 2 books because those were the only ones existing at the time, but it doesn't adapt them equally. The first 4 episodes convert the story of the first book, and thus are able to include that book's entire story for the most part. But the second book, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, is then crammed into the final 2 episodes. To do that, a great deal of the second book is cut out. And by a great deal, I mean almost the entire first half of it. In doing that, the last 2 episodes, and thus the series as a whole, almost completely eliminate just what made Hitchhiker's Guide unique and special at the time compared to so many other sci-fi stories. I'm gonna try to explain what all they left out as quickly as I can, but it's still very complex, so bear with me, and you might still want to even take notes. At the end of the first book, the group escapes the police robots thanks largely to a pretty clever move from their robot buddy Marvin, and get back on the Heart of Gold and do indeed go looking for the restaurant at the end of the universe. However, the second book starts with them being chased by the Vogons looking to finish the job because the person that hired them adamantly wanted every last remnant of Earth destroyed. See, it's revealed in the second book that the real reason the Earth was destroyed was not to build a hyperspace bypass, but to make sure the Earth never completed its program. This was all on the order of an intergalactic psychiatrist named Gag Halfront, who believed that if the secret to life, the universe, and everything was ever discovered, everyone in the universe would become happy, and psychiatrists like him would be out of work. Now, you're free to decide for yourselves if leaving that detail out of the TV series was a good or bad thing, because I will concede that even without it, the idea that aliens would demolish an entire planet to make way for their own infrastructure is is still a clever analogy for government bureaucracy and how gentrification affects other individuals. But that's only the beginning, because by wiping out the first half of the second book, they also eliminate the side plot involving Zaphod Beeblebrox, which to me was some of the best writing of the whole series. Yes, Arthur Dent is the central character of the series, but Zaphod Beeblebrox was just as essential a character for the story's big message, especially in the first 2 issues. From the very start in the TV series, they completely eliminate the little detail that Zaphod is actually the president of the whole galaxy, which is how he was able to steal the Heart of Gold in the first place. In fact, the only reason he got himself elected president was so he could steal the Heart of Gold, an idea that was supposedly given to him by the previous president. This was all crucial to the book's big joke that those who are actually able to get themselves elected into government office are also the same people who should not be allowed anywhere near government office. And it just goes downhill from what they cut out from the second book. See, there they escape the Vogons by using the improbability drive, which teleports Zaphod and Marvin to the planet Ursa Minor Beta, the home of the Hitchhiker's Guide's publishing company, and the Heart of Gold with everyone else into Zaphod's pocket. Zaphod is then taken prisoner and sent to Frogstar World B, escapes and finds out he's actually in a simulated world thanks to an executive of that publishing company named Zarnawhoop, returns to the real universe by taking the Heart of Gold out of his pocket, and then back on the Heart of Gold, tells the improbability drive to take them to the nearest place to eat, sending them to the restaurant at the end of the universe. All that gets left out of the TV show, where instead of the improbability drive taking them to the restaurant, that exploding computer on Magrathea sends them into the future to the restaurant somehow. And it said the restaurant was built on the remains of Magrathea, not Frogstar B as in the book. Now, after this, the show does fall back in line where the book was at this point. The 5th episode shows what the group encounters while at the restaurant, right up to where they reunite with Marvin, who had been left on the planet for the past several million years, and is now working as a valet in the parking garage. And Zaphod convinces everyone to slip away in a cool black spaceship that's parked there, unaware that the ship belongs to a rock band and is programmed to plummet into a sun as part of the band's performance, forcing them to have to use a malfunctioning teleporter on the ship to escape death once again. But again, this is where eliminating Zaphod's side plot creates another major plot hole. Here, his only motivation to take a new ship is because here the Heart of Gold was left behind all the way back in the past or something. The reason he did it in the books was because he knew Zarnawhoop was still on board the Heart of Gold and didn't want to deal with him. See, it turns out Zarnawhoop had been manipulating Zaphod from the very beginning to help him in his quest to find the person who actually rules the entire universe. This subplot was continued further as Zarnawhoop uses the improbability drive to intercept Zaphod and Trillian while in transport and bring them back to the Heart of Gold so Zaphod can continue helping him in his quest, where they find out that the supposed ruler of the entire universe is a creepy old hermit living in a shack at the end of the universe who isn't sure if the universe outside his shack even exists. The underlying message that one man, one being, cannot be solely responsible for the actions of millions of other people of either a country, a planet, and definitely not the entire universe is just absolutely brilliant in its execution. All that gets removed from the TV show, as we only see what happens to Arthur and Ford instead. That plot is for the most part accurate and still well done, but it alone doesn't convey the full purpose that the plot of Restaurant at the End of the Universe was meant to convey. They end up on an Ark ship containing an alien race called the Golga Frenchums, who were tricked into leaving their planet to go and colonize another one, and the planet they arrive on to colonize turns out to be prehistoric Earth. And these Golga Frenchums? Well, let's just say they could have been the inspiration for a certain comic strip made by someone else named Adams. Now, keeping the Golga Frenchums in the story does salvage a small portion of the humor of the original, particularly with Arthur and Ford's realization that humans were never supposed to be on the Earth from the beginning, and that by their ancestors migrating here from another planet and taking over as the Earth's dominant species, they completely fracked up the Earth's program, so finding out the ultimate question to life, the universe, and everything was never going to happen anyway. Unfortunately, we don't get the exact same ending as the book, where Arthur is left laying with some hot Golga Frenchum chick, talking about how he's pretty much given in to the madness, and even threw the Hitchhiker's Guide into the river. It's sad this is left out, because I am certain Arthur had sex with that woman after the ending, and you will never convince me otherwise. But that kind of sums up the TV version of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's not terrible, just disappointing. When the Dom made a huge 2-part review of the 2005 movie, he said the film clearly suffered from Adams no longer being around to directly aid production, and thus why the movie didn't get Adams's humor and style. But in a way, that kind of makes the TV show more of a disappointment, because Adams was involved with this production and it didn't get the message either. The overall message and humor of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, at least in the first 2 to 3 books, was to ridicule the arrogance and hubris of humanity and 20th century society in particular. Our belief that religion and technology define us and are why we must be the most important species in the entire universe. It's meant to try and knock humans down a few pegs and make us consider that we might not be the greatest things in the cosmos just because we have sports and digital watches. That's what really separated it from other British sci-fi serials like Doctor Who and Red Dwarf, and it is so freakishly uncanny as to how much of that humor and commentary is still so relevant 40 years later. By taking a lot of that humor out of the story, the TV version of Hitchhiker's Guide really doesn't differentiate much from those other shows, or even from American sci-fi shows like the original Battlestar Galactica, which did invoke criticisms of bureaucracy and government management. Add in some questionable casting choices and moments where the pacing really seems to drag, and it leaves you with something that just feels like it could have been better, making you wonder why they couldn't have added just a couple more episodes and kept more of the material in. I will concede that every version of Hitchhiker's Guide has its own variances, and by most accounts, Douglas Adams seemed to have wanted it that way. Still, I wouldn't be surprised if he himself was not satisfied with this production, because there were reportedly some creative differences that led to the show not getting a second season. So Adams instead focused on creating the third book, Life, the Universe, and Everything, where he used the plot elements he'd planned for a second TV season, which were mostly based on the Doctor Who episode Doctor Who and the Cricket Men. For the record, I did like the third book, and feel as if the novel series had stopped there, it would have been a fitting conclusion. Watching this thing, though, it actually makes me look forward to seeing what they can do with a new series being planned for Hulu that now has a 2022 launch date. Hopefully they can come up with a new adaptation with a much better conclusion than what we got with the book series. I think most of you know what I mean. But yes, this is another example where I highly recommend you check out the original books first to really see for yourself just how much of a brilliant satirical genius Douglas Adams really was. But don't worry, my rowdy friends, there are some examples of TV adaptations of books where maybe the adaptation turned out to be the better piece. We'll be looking at one of those examples next time on the TV Trash Summer of Reading.